I always go for a sort of transparent first sort of approach. Just explain to people what you're doing and why you're doing it, because it impacts them in so many ways. People are choosing to spend a chunk of their life here. They surely deserve to know.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Plumm Pod, where we talk about all things HR and mental health. I'm your host, Georgia, and founder of Access HR. On today's episode, I'm joined by Jag Gill, People Operations Leader, and we delve into the difference between PeopleOps and traditional HR. Jag, hello.
Hello, hi.
Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode.
Thanks for having me.
So I actually saw you speak at an event at the end of last year. And from listening to you, I thought I absolutely need to get him on a podcast. So thank you so much for saying yes.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you.
So before we get into it for the topic of today's episode, there's a question that I love to ask every single guest. It really helps me to give our audience a better understanding and a breakdown into you and your background. So the question is, was HR part of the plan, or did this happen by chance?
It definitely wasn't part of the plan. Definitely not. I mean, I was actually a photographer in a previous life, I guess. And that was amazing. I loved it. It became a bit more of a sort of a business and a chore. So I stepped away from it. I got into recruitment, hiring mostly sort of technical individuals. And I was so much more interested about the individual's journey that took me into the HR route.
Amazing. How did you find the transition from photography to recruitment?
It was difficult working for somebody else,
Mm-hmm.
But I think, leapfrogging into maybe PeopleOps now, I'm able to use that creative side of me in some way.
So PeopleOps, that is our topic for today's episode. It may be a term and a title that people haven't heard of before. So can you break it down for me? What is PeopleOps and how does it differ from the traditional HR?
Yeah, of course. So people operations, I guess. And this is my opinion. I feel like a lot of people have their own view of it, but I see it as HR 2.0. And I say that because everything that people are doing in people operations feels like just a refreshed version of HR, So to put it in simple terms, I guess, where HR can feel quite siloed, where you're only working on HR, I guess, people operations is more of an umbrella. And the clue is probably in the operations side, where you are taking a bigger role in the HR tech stack, actually implementing it, focusing a lot more data. So that, I think, is the key differentiator.
I can really resonate with you saying HR operating in silo, and a lot of my career, and especially because I qualified in the HR space, you feel that you have to stay in that lane. And for me, throughout my career, I didn't hear of people ops. It's actually quite a recent term for me. And I would love to know a bit more in terms of what do you do when you're doing people and ops so that they can work in unison together that's different from traditional HR?
It's one team,
Yes.
right? Rather than it being sort of two separate things, right? So rather than HR saying, hey, we need to implement this HR stack, tech stack, can you do this for us? Person in IT, person in ops, we need to do payroll in some form. Can you do this for us? Ops and payroll. It sort of is within the umbrella and the individuals doing it. And I guess it works best in your sort of seed to Series B startup environments, because that's when you need sort of a leaner team.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, yeah, that's probably the way that it works better together rather than two separate entities.
Do you find that when you're doing both people and ops as an operation, that you spend more time in one or the other? Or do they just work in unison naturally?
I think they work naturally together. They're just, if you really think about it, they are sort of one thing, right? Because HR is so central to the business in every way possible, and so is operations. You can see it as one thing, right? I mean, for example, again, I'll go back to implementing a HRIS. It touches every part of the business, right? It's part of the employee experience. Why wouldn't you do that as someone in HR?
Mm-hmm. And I also think from my experience, I've typically always been in the traditional HR lane, as I mentioned earlier, where we've had a separate people team and we've had a separate operations team. And we've tried to work together collaboratively. But I actually love people ops in the way of the ops side has always missed that human element. It's been seen as more of just a transaction. And this is a really lovely way that we can start to then work together. Moving from your recruitment role into people ops, what made you go straight to ops rather than the traditional HR?
I was doing sort of, a lot of traditional HR bits and bobs like ER, employee relations and things like that. And that was fine and that was good. But I felt
I feel you on that. The pause before the it was fine. I felt that deeply.
yeah.
It's fine.
It was fine, but I felt that was very reactive, right? You're dealing with things with the best of intentions, but it's too late at that point,
Yeah.
right? So I noticed that to really make a difference, you need to be sort of not one step removed, but one step ahead of that.
Yeah.
And where I was working at the time, I got given a great opportunity to work directly with the director of operations and, work with the project teams there. And, that's where I got my first real taste of ops. And I was like, great, you can actually do some real change here, before it gets too late. For example, if people are enjoying the project that they're on, this business with a time and materials business, right? So people are on projects and different clients all the time. So if people aren't enjoying it, you should be on the front foot. And, before it gets to HR and someone saying, I'm thinking of leaving, you're understanding from their manager, like, okay, so they're not enjoying what they're doing at the moment. What do they want to work on? What do they want to improve in terms of their skill set? What project can we put them on that sort of enables them to flourish? And that was that sort of key moment for me. It was, okay, so there's something here. And I wanted to delve down there.
Love that. And why is it so important that modern businesses start to take more of a people ops approach?
Good question. So I think, sticking with maybe the sort of the startup environment, maybe up to Series B, like sub 500 sort of employees or what have you. We've noticed in the market that teams need to be leaner, right? I don't know if it's still too soon to talk about the great resignation or the great sort of, the tech bubble bursting a couple of years ago. That happened. And, sort of post that, what I've realized at least is that HR teams was a part of that sort of, that shift as well. So what I'm realizing is you need to be somebody with multiple skill sets. The teams are leaner. So you need to be able to do the HR, you need to do a bit of the payroll, you need to do a bit of the ops and the implementation. You need to wear multiple hats. And I guess you're able to do that specifically nowadays because there's a lot more self-service in HR. There's a lot more AI in HR. There's a lot more admin and drudgery that sort of can be shifted away from the typical HR individual that gives them scope to work on the ops side.
And would you say that workplace trends like AI are driving people more into a people ops role?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you think about it, if you're working in a traditional HR role,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you might be asked, "What's the holiday policy?" a couple times a month. Although that might be a cause for concern,
Yeah.
because if someone's asking the same question all the time, there's something wrong with your handbook, you know? Uh, that's only one example, I guess. Or someone might be asking, what's the maternity or paternity policy, and you know, the intricacies of that. Although now you have so much AI and self-service that you're not having to answer those questions, you know? And that can be quite scary for some people,
Mm-hmm.
because you're saying, well, I'm not useful anymore, you know? And, but sorry, what I'm trying to say is that allows you actually that gives you space to work on interesting and cool things like implementing a great HR stack in some way, shape, or form, or, you know,
Yes.
keeping on top of because the AI and the, you know, that you may use is only as good as the information you feed it. So,
Mm.
or the data that you feed it. So focusing on the information data that you have in your organization, that becomes a big part of your role.
You started to talk then about agility when you were talking how people in HR really, when you're moving to people ops, you can do a little bit of payroll, ops, HR as it's traditionally known, and moving forward more into people. How important is it to be agile now as a HR people professional?
Oh, huge.
Mm.
Yeah, so important. I this what I'm about to say might come across as a bit, I don't know, a bit hard-headed, or it might not land well, but in my experience at least,
Mm-hmm.
I have felt that people in traditional HR roles sometimes create bureaucracy around them to protect their jobs, and they maybe because they feel like they won't be important without them. So the reason I mention that is because if you really embrace agility, you need to be happy with change.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be happy to like break things down and structures and rebuild them. You need to be happy and comfortable with transparency, because being transparent is a big part of being agile, right?
And there's a lot of us who are guilty of not being open to change. And I think we are so slow to change as a function. I'm super open to it because I see the future, but not everybody is the same. And I think they're also doing themselves a bit of a disservice
Mm.
by not being open to it, by not being agile and seeing that we need to grow. We're telling everybody else in business we need to be adaptable, we need to be innovative, we need to be doing all these things. Yet we're still the last doing the traditional compliance, admin, and staying in that lane. I completely agree with everything you've just said. So with people ops, how can we ensure that we're really focusing and driving on retention and engagement? How can we make sure we're having that business sense with people ops?
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, so number one, looking at data,
Mm-hmm.
you know, understanding that people ops, people operations, HR, whatever you want to call it, you know, um, spans beyond just the function. It's not siloed. It's you know, it's working with managers, it's working with leadership, it's working with every part of the business. And I don't know if this complicates things, but adding in something like systems thinking,
Mm-hmm.
which sees things as like, right, everything is sort of impacted by its I guess counterpart in some way, right? So if you take a systems thinking approach, you realize that actually retention might be something to do with a manager's performance,
Mm-hmm.
which you probably haven't thought about before, or retention might be something to do with a massive amount of change that you made in the business elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
So taking a more holistic approach to looking at, you know, what could be the main cause for this, and not just a case of, oh, people are leaving because our churn rate is, you know, I don't know, X percentage, or people normally leave after 18 months. That's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
You're just putting a plaster over it. You're making an excuse almost. So if you can take a holistic approach and look at data from a myriad of places, you
Mm-hmm.
know, that I think helps with retention.
How can we start to learn How can we start to learn more of a system approach, taking it really back to basics? Someone's never done it before. How can we get started?
Yeah, so I listen to podcasts,
Yeah.
so I'd say podcasts, YouTube, really understand what system thinking is. But for this example, really, it's just visualizing. Step one is just visualizing that you're more than just a function.
Mm-hmm.
And every time you sort of make a change, start small. Say for example, you're making a change in your appraisal cycle,
Yeah.
right? Trial it with one team, and this is agile, right? Just trialing and testing. So trial it with one team, and and just take data points where you wouldn't take data points from historically.
Mm-hmm.
Trial it, bring it into the cycle, see if that works, and then if that works, push it out to the rest of the business, right? So that's one small thing you can do. But really, the first thing you need to do is just learn, understand, accept, and see that you're just more than this siloed function.
Such an important message. And we are so desperate as a function to get out of that lane. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily know how. And being agile is absolutely one of those ways we can do it. I love, and I know so many people listening will be thinking about their appraisal system. It's always a really good one that we can feel where it hits home. Try and test. Don't go in and just do a one size fits all and hope for the best and we'll speak about it in 6 months. Get a small cohort, try it, test it, learn, evolve, and see really what's going to work for your team, your demographic, and build from there.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of agility, how can HR professionals start to change their mindset in terms of a modern future of work that we're seeing at the moment?
Having to change their mindsets in line with the future of work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good question. I find that, in my experience at least, asking why
Mm-hmm.
is a good first step to changing your mindset, because someone who works in HR, you sort of do things because you're either told to do them that way and they sort of make sense, or you've done them in a certain way for so long, you found sort of workarounds, and I think asking why is a big first step. Why
Mm-hmm.
are we doing things this way? And then look for patterns,
Mm.
right? So are we as HR professionals being sort of shunned out of conversations wider than HR? Okay, if that's the case, you need to sort of really fight for your seat at the table and sort of say, no, we need a space. We need to be in the space to help you make this decision. So I think, step one is just question everything. Always ask why, why are we doing it this way? And then you can start to sort of open up that side of your mind where you're sort of thinking, well, actually, yeah, I don't know why we're doing it this way. Okay, let's try and not so much rip it up and start again, but, see what you can change to make things a bit more efficient. If
Yeah,
that makes sense.
totally. That does make sense. And I'm just thinking now, what if we actually don't know the why, or potentially we're unsure of the why because maybe the business actually doesn't have their strategy intact, which I think a lot of the time the business doesn't.
Mm,
And as HR, we have to try and figure out how our people strategy can underpin the business strategy
mm.
that isn't there. So if anyone's struggling to know the why, are there any questions or anything that we can start to ask internally to get a better understanding of that why?
So why, when you say why, do you mean the?
So when we're saying with any when we're changing our mindset of understanding why we're going to do that,
Mm,
more often than not, it'll be important for the business to make a change.
mm,
But sometimes we don't know what the business strategy is and their whole why.
mm.
What are the questions that we can start to ask internally so that we're all on the same page and we understand the why?
Yeah, yeah, of course. I'd say first of all, bring in champions or stakeholders from across the organization to the conversation. Right, going back to systems thinking. If you're going to make a change in the business, it's going to impact pretty much everyone in the business in
So
some way,
true.
shape, or form. Right. So I'd say bring in stakeholders from across the business. It's a tough question to answer because I just go back to just ask why.
Yeah.
Right?
Just ask.
Because that's what I do.
Yeah.
Going from my personal experience, I just sort of, okay, but why are you doing that? Okay, so you want to make a change there.
Yeah.
Why? How does that fit into the bigger picture? Have you thought about how that's going to impact this other part of the organization or this under individual? Have you asked people what they think? Have you taken others on the journey? I was working with an organization, and leadership trust was at an all-time low, right? And and I was sort of brought in to mainly fix that initially. And what I've quickly realized is that there was lots of change happening in the business.
Mm-hmm.
The leadership didn't know why. They were just doing change because they felt like, well, the real answer is they didn't give things enough time to breathe and to understand if it was really working or not. But trust was at all-time low because they didn't take anyone else along for the journey, right? So there wasn't like I said earlier, what do you think? What do you think of the organization? What do you think we should do? And taking people along for the journey, explaining why. Funnily enough, asking why and explaining the why, is a big part of human psychology, right? Just okay, this is what we're going to do, and this is why we're doing it. Have you done that? These are the questions.
There's two pieces there that I think are so key with what you've just said. Firstly, we need to be asking better questions. And I think, unfortunately, we don't sometimes. Personally, in my career, I've been told I ask one too many questions. And rather than just asking questions for the sake of questions, I now ask more intentional questions, exactly the ones that you've just given as an example. And we need to get better at that to understand. And then secondly, the comms for people internally to understand why they're making that change. You were just speaking around leaders. I see that a lot. I definitely see that with my clients when they're like, oh, well, this is happening because it's happening. And they don't really know the why. So going back to people ops, do you have a comms strategy or anything that you really focus on with clients so that people know the why?
I always go for a sort of transparent first
Mm-hmm.
sort of approach. Just explain to people what you're doing and why you're doing it, because it impacts them in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
People are choosing to spend a chunk of their life here. They surely deserve to know. But I use a matrix, right? So there's a difference between telling people everything and telling people some things, because I'll never forget this. I used to work with a leader who overshared almost, other end of the spectrum. And then I was speaking to someone in the organization, and he said to me, why is he telling us this stuff? I'm not paid enough to worry about these things. And that will always stick with me, right? And that's when the matrix was born. So like what I say to leaders is, okay, is it going to impact their day to day on a massive scale? Are you able to tell them right now? Okay, tell them.
Mm-hmm.
Is it something like revenue's a bit tight for the next couple of months, but it'll be fine in the next month, a few courses after that? You don't need to tell them that, really. So figure out where in the matrix sort of, the truth lies, and share accordingly. That's the approach that I take.
I'm obsessed with that. That's actually really good because I find a lot of leaders now, especially because a lot of them don't get training, they are really struggling to find the balance between intentional and purposeful information, but then also oversharing because they want to tell their team everything so that they understand their stresses. But then they also need to put professional boundaries in place. And we've also got Gen Z coming in who have a different expectation of work. So they feel like they were owed information. So I really feel for leaders at the moment, but that's a really helpful matrix that you just described. Anybody who is moving into people ops, let's say they are younger in their career, they're more junior in their career, how can they get started?
Yeah, just get curious.
Mm.
Get very curious. So think about the sort of the adjacent skills or the adjacent parts of your organization, at least traditionally. So, what sits adjacent to traditional HR? Well, maybe payroll, maybe traditional ops. just get curious about that. It can start very simple. Say, for example, if something needs to be done in the organization that sits adjacent to you, get in on it. Say, oh, can I have a go at that? Or can I work with you on that project? Just get curious and start speaking to project managers, and sort of see how they do things. And yeah, just get curious and get stuck in with those adjacent sort of, functions.
And you never know as well when those functions will help you
Yeah.
later down the line. One of the biggest pieces of advice I give is you are never too junior to build relationships with stakeholders across the company, because a stakeholder can either speed up or slow down a people project, and we want them to speed up.
Yeah, absolutely. And absolutely. I mean, there's such a massive, like, if you think of a Venn diagram, there's so much sort of like a crossover between payroll and HR in the form of benefits.
Yeah.
And nobody seems to sort of talk about the importance of that relationship or that crossover between payroll and HR, right? And that's, I think, the beauty of people operations or people ops, where it sort of takes those Venn diagrams and it sort of says, right, I'm going to focus on that crossover.
Yeah. Amazing. I only have one last question for you. And the last question is, looking back on your career from photography, recruitment, all the way into people ops, what is one piece of advice you would give your younger self?
Keep going and trust the process.
I like that.
Because there were times in my career I was like, is it operations I want to go into? Yes, I do want to go into operations. For a little while, I was doing purely operations roles, and I started missing HR, and I was so confused about my identity as an individual. Like, what do I want to focus on? And then, I eventually got to people ops. So I guess, yeah, trust the process and stick with it.
Did you put pressure on yourself in that moment of trying to feel like you had to choose?
Yeah. Massively. I think as in society in general, you want to put yourself in buckets of identity. And I didn't have an identity in terms of my career. Because when you meet new people, everyone says, oh, so what do you do? Really, the first question should be like, what's your favorite dinosaur? Right? But when people speak
What is your favorite dinosaur?
I like the velociraptor because it's
okay.
cool. And actually, velociraptors were as small as dogs if you look at the data that's coming out now. I might be wrong. Let me just check this. But they weren't as big as they. Anyway, what's your favorite dinosaur?
To be fair, that was going to be mine. I'm just thinking of the dinosaur film and when I've been to Disney and the dinosaur parks. Triceratops.
They're cool.
I'm going to keep that one in my head.
And the herbivores.
They are. But I don't know how people will respond if I say to them like, hey, so what's your favourite dinosaur?
It's a bit weird, isn't it? But that's good because it's sort of outside.
At least they'll remember me.
norms. Exactly. Yeah. So what was the point I'm making? Oh yeah. So when people sort of say, what do you do?
Yeah.
What do you do for a living? That's the first question they ask. And it was difficult for me to give them an answer like, oh, I'm in ops or I'm in HR. And it almost becomes an identity crisis, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because you put so much pressure on yourself.
I agree. And I also think that's a really important message for a lot of people, especially with us being in HR. And there's so much great things that are happening in the HR and people space. And that's such a key takeaway for anybody listening. Don't put pressure on yourself. Go with what you enjoy. And now is our time.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jag. I really appreciate your time on this episode. And see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Like this episode? Click here for more HR talk. And if you're just catching up, check out our previous episodes right here.